You will hear about torture tools, but the real weapon was time. They slowed death down, kept it public, and turned fear into routine. Today, I show the cruelest punishments in human history. Unbelievable, but real. Let's start with number 10, crucifixion. You know what makes crucifixion terrifying, even before the nails? Rome built it to be a public message, not just a death. This was a punishment that tried to shame you first, then break you, and it did both in front of everyone who had to walk by. A lot of Roman crucifixions started with scourging first, which meant brutal whipping before the cross even entered the story. And after that, the condemned usually had to carry the crossbeam load to the place of execution. Why does that detail matter? Because the whole process forced the victim to arrive already wrecked, already shaking, already struggling to stand. At the site, the upright post was often already planted, which turns the final moment into a routine setup, and victims could be tied or nailed through the wrists or hands to the crossbeam, then lifted and fastened to the upright. Britannica even notes the crossbeam could sit 2.5 to 3.5 meters above the ground, around 9 to 12 feet, and that height is not random. It pushed the body into a posture where breathing turned into work, then into pain, then into panic. This was never built for speed, it was built for time, because crucifixion aimed to be prolonged and visible, the kind of suffering that does not end quickly and does not let the crowd forget. Rome used it heavily against enslaved people and rebels, especially when the state wanted everyone watching to understand one point: do not try this again. And the clearest example comes after Spartacus, because when the revolt was crushed in 71 BCE, ancient sources report 6,000 rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. That stretch is often described as roughly 200 kilometers between Rome and Capua, which turned a main road into a corridor of dying bodies. And it was placed where travelers could not avoid seeing it, because deterrence was the whole goal. Now hold that thought, because China had a punishment that used the crowd too, but it attacked something even deeper than pain. Here comes number 9, lynching. Lynching gets tossed around online as death by 1,000 cuts, but the scarier truth lies in how it worked as a public ritual, not a math problem. Serious scholarship points out it often involved far fewer cuts, commonly described as about 8 to 10, and the horror came from the performance, the order, and the meaning forced onto the body. This was not handed out casually. It was reserved for crimes viewed as extreme, like forms of treason, because the state wanted the sentence to sound like a warning that traveled faster than any messenger. The chilling part is the mix of legal punishment, public spectacle, and body symbolism, because it was not only kill the person, it was erase them socially, and that is a different kind of fear. Sources commonly describe lynching as used in China from around 900 CE until it was banned in 1905, and that end date hits harder than people expect. Why? Because photography existed by then, which helps explain why the image of lynching still sticks in modern memory, even for people far from China and far from that era. One research project analyzing late Qing reporting describes 453 executions recorded between September 1872 and April 1905, running right up to abolition. And scholars stress its role as deterrence, a performance of state power. That means the crowd was never a side issue. The crowd was part of the design. And there is one more layer people miss. The fear was not only pain, it was what dismemberment meant in a society where bodily integrity tied into dignity, family honor, and the afterlife in popular belief. That is why states choose punishments like this. They aim at identity, not only flesh. Europe had its own version of identity through bones, and it was built around a wheel. Let's move to number 8, the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, also called the Wheel of Catherine, sounds like a medieval rumor until you realize it was a real public method meant to turn a body into a warning sign. This was not about a quick ending. It was about making a human frame collapse in a way the crowd could recognize, bone by bone. Britannica's older encyclopedia description matches the core setup. The victim's limbs were stretched along the spokes, the wheel was slowly revolved, and bones were broken with an iron bar. Think about that pace for a second. Slow turning, repeated strikes, and the audience watching each break become visible proof of state control. That mix, torture plus prolonged dying plus display, is why it sits in memory as one of Europe's most feared punishments. It shows up across Europe from antiquity through the medieval and early modern period, and it survives into the 19th century in some places, which always surprises people who assume it vanished much earlier. The abolition dates are blunt and specific. It was abolished in Bavaria, 1813, and the electorate of Hesse, 1836. And Wikipedia's compiled record says the last known wheel execution in Prussia was 1841. Those numbers pin it to a world that is already drifting toward the modern era, which makes the method feel even colder. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the legal logic could be framed as a mirror punishment, especially for crimes like highway robbery, meaning the penalty was supposed to reflect the harm done to society. But here is what makes the wheel uniquely nasty: what came after the breaking, because in many cases the broken body was left displayed or positioned on the wheel, sometimes to die slowly, sometimes after a final blow. The crowd was the feature, and England took that idea and built a full, multi-step horror show. Next one is number 7, hanged, drawn, and quartered. England had a punishment for high treason that did not aim for efficiency. It aimed for symbolic terror, and it did that by stretching the experience into stages. This was the premium tier penalty in medieval and early modern England, not because it worked better, but because it looked unforgivable. The sentence was not one clean act. It was a sequence designed to keep fear alive, dragged to the execution site, which is the drawn part, then hanged, then mutilated and divided, which is the quartered part. Britannica groups it with Europe's cruelest execution styles, and that makes sense when you see the way it turns punishment into choreography, step after step, each one meant to be understood by the crowd. Historical records use landmark cases as anchors, and William Wallace, 1305, sits inside that tradition of English treason punishment. Even after death, the after could matter almost as much as the execution itself, because body parts could be displayed on city gates or bridges as a continuing warning. The famous example is London Bridge, used for heads and quarters, turning a daily crossing into a permanent billboard of state wins. That is the point. You do not scare one person. You scare the whole city every time someone walks past the display. The legal end date is also sharp. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was abolished as a formal punishment in England by the Forfeiture Act 1870, which limited the penalty for treason to hanging and ended the old forfeiture system tied to treason convictions. Treason was treated as the ultimate betrayal, not only against a person, but against the political order, and the punishment was designed to make that betrayal look cosmically unforgivable. Now watch how law can become its own kind of trap, because England also had a way to crush you simply for refusing to speak. Let's move to number 6, pressing to death. Imagine standing in court, refusing to plead, and realizing the system has a tool for silence, and that tool is a pile of weight. In England, if you stood mute, the court could respond with peine forte et dure, pressing the accused under weights until a plea came out, or until the body gave up. Britannica describes it plainly as an English practice tied to refusal to plead, and the cruelty sits inside the logic. If you do not enter a plea, the court cannot move forward in the normal way, so the system uses pain to force the process to continue, which turns the procedure into violence. Pressing could take days, and it was not always a steady one increase and done pattern, which means it could become a slow grind of suffocation, crushed ribs, and exhaustion. The scary part is the waiting, because each added weight becomes its own question. Will you speak now, Will you hold out? Will your chest hold one more hour? A famous North America-linked case is Giles Corey in Salem, pressed to death in 1692, with the Library of Congress noting the pressing happened between September 17th and 19th, 1692. That is roughly 2 to 3 days of deliberate crushing, not an executioner swinging once, but a system applying pressure until the body stops. And there is a clean legislative end date. Peine forte et dure was abolished in Great Britain in 1772 by the Felony and Piracy Act, 1772. After 1772, refusing to plead was treated as equivalent to a plea, and later reforms shifted how courts handled it, which tells you lawmakers finally dropped a practice that turned silence into a death sentence. Out at sea, discipline also had its own nightmares, and one of them used the ship itself as the weapon. Here comes number 5. Keel hauling. Keel hauling sounds like pirate legend until you see it documented as a real maritime punishment, especially tied to Dutch naval practice, where a person was dragged under a ship's hull. That means the ship, the water, and the crew all become part of the sentence, and you do not get to step away from any of it. History.com describes it as one of the worst sailor punishments used roughly between the mid-1600s and mid-1800s, and even the word keel haul comes from Dutch roots. So this is not a single wild story. It sits inside an era of naval discipline where fear had to travel fast across a floating world. One documented Dutch East India Company era example lands on a hard date, on November 11, 1652. A sailor named Jan Blank was keel-hauled under command of Jan van Riebeck, and the record notes he was also whipped 150 lashes and then enslaved for 2 years for desertion. That stacking matters because it shows keel-hauling could be part of a punishment pile, not always a single act, but a series designed to destroy the person physically and socially. Even when someone survived the drag, the hull could shred skin, and the water adds its own terror, panic, drowning risk, and repeated impacts, all while the crew watches. Unlike a land execution, you are trapped in the middle of the ocean with the same people who just did it to you, which adds psychological fear on top of physical trauma. We also have signs of legal change. Dutch language material on naval punishments records reforms where keel-hauling penalties were replaced by other punishments in naval codes. And major navies sometimes pointed to keel-hauling as an example of what they did not do. The U.S. Naval Institute notes the American Navy avoided punishments like keel-hauling and instead relied heavily on flogging in that era. Fire, though, has always had a different kind of crowd pull, and one punishment built an entire spectacle around it. Let's move to number 4. Burning at the stake. Burning at the stake hits people on instinct because fire is visible, loud, and terrifying. But the legal history is sharp, not vague. In England, burning was used for heresy and for certain forms of treason, and it was also applied to women convicted of petty treason, like killing a husband or employer. That "why women" detail turns ugly fast. Some legal writers claimed it avoided public exposure of the female body compared to male punishments, yet the result stayed the same: a public killing by fire. The crowd still gathered, the sentence still announced itself in smoke, and the fear still spread. By the 1700s, it often became customary to strangle first, then burn the body, which tells you even executioners and crowds recognized burning alive as a level of cruelty that looked monstrous. But it did not always go in a merciful order. Accounts describe cases where the fire was lit too early and the condemned suffered alive, which means even the supposed softening could fail in the worst way. One anchor case comes with a hard date. Catherine Murphy, also known as Christian Murphy, was executed on the 18th of March, 1789 at Newgate, and she is widely cited as the last woman in England officially executed by burning. Her case helped fuel political pressure, and the punishment was abolished soon after. The Treason Act, 1790, ended burning at the stake for women convicted of treason-related crimes, replacing it with drawing and hanging. So this is not only medieval. England is still doing stake burnings in 1789, then switching the law in 1790. If fire turns punishment into theater, impalement turns it into a warning that can last, because the body stays visible in a way that forces everyone to understand the message. Next one is number 3. Impalement. Impalement is exactly what it sounds like. A person is penetrated by a stake or pole, and the method can be arranged to prolong dying. That is the part people struggle to even picture, and that reaction is part of why it worked as terror. The mind fills in the gaps, and the fear grows. It shows up across cultures and centuries, but one historically associated context is Southeastern Europe and Ottoman border politics, where brutality was used as messaging. A key reason it became infamous is that it works as terror propaganda. You do not need to kill everyone. You need a few bodies displayed in a way that makes the next town surrender. That is why chroniclers repeatedly connect it to crimes against the state and political revolt. On the Ottoman side, historical discussion notes impalement was used for certain offenses, and sometimes during war contexts as warning and intimidation, which ties it directly to the idea of controlling populations through fear. On the Wallachian side, Vlad III is inseparable from this punishment. Britannica notes his nickname, Tepish, meaning the impaler, is tied to accounts of impaling opponents. Modern academic reassessment even discusses how sources accused Vlad of slaughter figures in the tens of thousands and alleges mass impalement numbers, while also warning that such figures may be exaggerated and need evaluation. That mix, documented political use plus lurid, possibly inflated propaganda numbers, helps explain why impalement keeps its place in the worst punishments list. It lives where real state violence meets deliberate fear storytelling, and that combination spreads fast across borders. Now take that idea of fear plus performance, then replace the executioner with an animal trained to obey commands. Let's move to number 2, execution by elephant. Execution by elephant was not a one-off stunt. It is documented across South and Southeast Asia as a method of capital punishment where elephants were used to crush or kill condemned people in public. That alone is hard to process, because it turns a living creature into a tool of law, and it does it in front of a crowd. The method could be fast or cruelly controlled. Accounts describe trained elephants that could kill immediately, or extend suffering depending on commands. That detail changes everything, because it means the execution could be shaped moment by moment, not only by force, but by deliberate choice. The College of St. George in Windsor notes it was a common mode of execution for thousands of years, and it began dying out with expanding European empires in the 17th and 18th centuries. That matters because it shows a long institutional lifespan, not a freak rumor, but a practice embedded enough to persist across dynasties and regions. For eyewitness-flavored historical material, Robert Knox's 1681 account of Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, is a major primary-era source on local customs and punishments from someone who spent 19 years captive there. Historians still cite it because it is detailed and close to the time, which gives the descriptions extra weight. What makes elephant execution especially terrifying is the crowd logic. The state uses an enormous, intelligent animal to show that power is literally bigger than you. It is punishment staged as a living machine, and because the executioner is an animal, it adds unpredictability that humans fear on instinct. And if you think death ends the warning, Britain had a method that kept punishing long after the person stopped breathing. And the last is number 1, hanging in chains. Gibbeting, also called hanging in chains, was not only about killing someone, it was about turning the body into a long-term sign that the public could not avoid. This is punishment that keeps working after death, because the display stays up for months, sometimes years, forcing the warning into daily life. Britannica describes bodies being smeared with pitch or tallow to slow decomposition, so the corpse could remain visible longer. That detail is planned cruelty, not an accident, because it aims to keep the image fresh enough to scare people who pass by later, not only the crowd on the first day. This punishment also hijacked geography. Place the gibbet on a road, a coastline, or a town edge, anywhere people must pass, and suddenly ordinary travel turns into a forced lesson. Academic work notes the sheer crowd scale a fresh gibbet could draw, sometimes tens of thousands of spectators, because humans have trouble looking away from taboo, even when it scares them. The legal timeline in Britain is also sharp. A detailed historical chapter hosted by the U.S. National Library of Medicine notes the last gibbeting in Britain occurred in summer 1832, and after public outcry, it was removed from the books in 1834. That means gibbeting is not only medieval, it is still happening in the 1830s, right next to the industrial world people think of as modern. And the psychological cruelty is obvious. Even after death, the body becomes a prop.